Hello, my name is Dr. Akram Khatir. I'm a professor of history at North Carolina State University, where I'm also serving as the director of the Moise Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. On behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on the Israel-Lebanon Maritime Agreement that was signed October 11, 2022. And today we'll be speaking with Dr. Sami Atallah, the founding director of the Policy Initiative, which is based in Lebanon. And we'll be talking about the details of the agreement and its economic and political ramifications for Lebanon and for the region. Before we start the conversation, I would like to take a few minutes to introduce the Khairallah Center, to outline the ways we will conduct the conversation, and then to more fully introduce both the topic as well as Dr. Sami Atallah. I'm going to share with you the screen. Let's see, so if I'll do that. So the Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Study is dedicated to research about Lebanese immigrants in the United States and throughout the world, and to preserving and sharing that knowledge with the scholarly community and the general public. What I would like to do is share a very short 1.5 minutes video that will tell you a little bit about our mission, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about the event. So I'll be happy to provide any more answers about the center, but now I would like to turn my attention to the event that we have right now. So obviously this is going to be conducted primarily I'll start out with a conversation with Sami and myself, but what we would like to do, this is run as a webinar style, which means that you are automatically muted and your camera is off. However, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions that you have at any moment in time. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible, keeping in mind, of course, we have a lot of participants and a lot of questions, so we may not be able to cover them all. This is meant to provide just an overview, if you will. You may also be able to raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted, but preferably really type in your question. That's the easiest way for us to keep track of these questions. Now, very briefly, what I would like to talk about is this event that we're having here. Dr. Sami Atallah, who is trained in economics and political science, is the founding director of the Policy Initiative, a newly established Beirut-based think tank. Prior to that, he was the director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies from January 2011 until December 2020. He is currently leading several policy studies on political institutions and electoral behavior, economic diversification and export promotion, public finance, and the politics of procuring public contracts, aids and reforms, and local development and municipal finance, all in Lebanon. Sami has published 4 books on the national budget in Lebanon, decentralization in the Arab world, the future of petroleum in Lebanon, and the performance of the Lebanese parliament. He also published several academic papers, and Sami holds a PhD in politics from New York University. Now, just a little bit, one last bit here about what the topic we're dealing with. We have a range of people who are attending today, from undergraduate students at North Carolina State University to people involved in policy making at various institutions and organizations across the world. So just to give a brief background here a little bit, on Tuesday, October 11th, 2022, Lebanon and Israel reached an agreement demarcating a disputed maritime border between them after years of US-mediated negotiations. While limited in scope, a finalized deal marks a significant compromise between two neighboring countries with a history of war, Israeli occupation, and conflict, and opening the way for offshore energy exploration and easing a source of recent tensions. US mediators tried for more than a decade to broker a maritime border agreement between Lebanon and Israel, but finally the elements appear, at least, and we will learn more about this from Sami, but they appear to have fallen into place for a landmark deal between two countries officially and sometimes actively at war since 1948. Russia's war in Ukraine this year and Europe's resulting energy crisis have increased demand for natural gas, which the deal will enable Lebanon and Israel, presumably, to extract from the Mediterranean Sea. At the same time, and perhaps more importantly, Lebanon's spiraling economic crisis, impending Israeli elections, and rising tensions between Israel and Hezbollah added more incentive to finalize the deal. So today, again, we will be talking to Sami about this. And what I did is I asked Sami, I'm going to ask Sami some general questions to set the stage, and then again, we will take your Q&A as they come. Sami, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy to be with us and to shed a lot more light on a deal that is being heralded both in the United States as well as in Lebanon, and perhaps less muted in Israel as some sort of historic agreement. So first of all, let's just start out. What is this agreement exactly?
Very good. Well, first, thank you so much, Akram, for this very kind invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here, and particularly to be hosted by the Khairallah Center. Watching this video just brought me back to memories when I was living in the US, and I myself was about to become a member of the diaspora community. In fact, I went to the US thinking that I will become part of the diaspora community, and then I decided to come back. That's more than 12 or 15 years ago. In any case, so it's a very sort of touching to see all these pictures in these videos, because I so much relate to what many Lebanese went through, are going through, living there, and what have you. So it's good to communicate and interact with them through this platform. So again, great to be here. All right, so let's start with this. Indeed, this maritime agreement is a historical agreement in many ways, and largely because it's between two countries that are not only at war, but a country like Lebanon doesn't even recognize Israel. So that's really where, how do you have an agreement between two states that in fact don't really recognize each other, particularly in Lebanon's side, and that's what's so peculiar about it. But to have an agreement, let's start, what's the problem? There's a conflict, right? And I think going back to the, be good to actually maybe look at the map, and if I can trouble you, Akram, just to show it, because I think, so our participants can just follow with us here. So back in 2007, it all started back then. Lebanon basically, in attempt to start its exploration of oil and gas on its offshore, drew this maritime border with Cyprus. And by doing so, they actually made a big mistake, which Israel exploited very quickly, and it actually drew line number 1, which goes from almost the Naura, where you see, and you go the first line, and it's titled 1. Lebanon, or Lebanese authorities, very quickly realized their mistake. They went on to say, well, wait a minute, line number 1 is really not our line. Line 23 is our line. And in fact, here is the conflict between line 1 and line 23. The Lebanese government acknowledges that it's line 20, or recognizes that it's line 23, and the Israeli says, no, it's actually line 1. Clearly, if it's line 1, Israel has more maritime territory, maritime area, and if it's line 23, Lebanon has more area. So you can see what the conflict is here. How do you resolve this conflict? Who's right and who's wrong? This was sort of a big issue that took more than 15 years to resolve. The Americans joined the conversation, or joined, not the conversation, I should say, joined this conflict, trying to resolve it. And Ambassador Huff, and that's why we have line H for the ambassador's name, came to resolve this and suggested line H, whereby it gives Lebanon 60% of that disputed area and 40% to Israel. Lebanon refused. It said, no, our line is line 23, and we stick to that. And it took, obviously, 15 years later, or 10 years since they've accepted line 23, which was 2010, 12 years later, Lebanon thinks or claims, and Lebanese authorities, that they actually have won here by taking line 23 as they initially wanted. That's the narrative that we hear by particularly Lebanese authorities. How there's a glitch to this, whereby if you think that Lebanon's line is line 23 and Lebanon won, then one can say, well, Lebanon actually won, right? Or got what it wanted, let's say. But effectively, the Lebanese army disagrees with that assessment. In fact, the Lebanese army and the British Hydrographic Office, which is obviously based in the UK, and is an expert in maritime borders, says actually Lebanon's right is line 29 and not line 23, which means if that is the case, Lebanon lost 1,430 kilometers square. And the Lebanese authorities, while they were negotiating with the Israelis indirectly through the Americans, did not officially acknowledge that line 29 is the line that is for Lebanon, or is the legal maritime line. So the question is now, or at least for some, did Lebanon really win, or did Lebanon get a good deal, let's just say, or did Lebanon not get a good deal? If you think Lebanon actually is line 23, which by the way has no legal basis, line 23, then Lebanon can recognize or acknowledge, as Lebanese politicians have done, they claimed victory. However, the Lebanese army doesn't think so, and it actually claims that it's line 29, which means Lebanon actually lost. So this is where now we have this conflict. It has been resolved by acknowledging that Lebanon's line is line 23, whereby Lebanon, first of all, lost some territory, which sheds light on Lebanese authority mishandling the demarcation process in the last 15 years. But somehow no one is really talking about that in Lebanon, neither the media nor politicians. In fact, they're actually congratulating themselves for this feat. Now, this brings us to another issue here, is the agreement. And Akram, your question is, what does the agreement entail? And I think very quickly, I'd like to sort of highlight a few things about the agreement. Since it's line 23 here, basically, it says the following. It says that the Karish gas field, if you can see it also on the map, is for Israel. The fact that they mention it is for Israel, that tells you something about the legitimacy of line 29, because the Karish gas field is quite far from line 23. There's nothing to dispute. I mean, if you recognize line 23 as the official line, then there's nothing to talk about regarding the Karish gas field. Nevertheless, they actually stated in the agreement that the Karish gas field is to Israel, and the Kana gas field, which is the one just above it to the right, is actually for Lebanon. But here's the glitch, is that part of Kana gas field, as you can also see on the map, actually is south of line 23, right? There's a small portion of it. And what the deal does or says or states that Israel cannot explore the fields south of line 23. The operator contracted by Lebanese authorities can do so, but they have to notify the Israeli government when they go south of line 23, and they need the permission of the Israeli government to extract any oil. And any oil that is found in that field, which is south of line 23, it should be shared with the Israeli government through and as part of the operator meaning the oil company. And hence, this allows Lebanon to say, we are not sharing the revenues with the Israeli government. In fact, it's the operator or the basically oil company that's giving part of its profits to the Israeli government, and they'll decide on that together, sometime later. But the agreement is quite vague on how and what does it mean to have Israeli consent. How is that going to be communicated? How is that going to be secured? We don't know really much about that, because that could give the Israeli the authority or the power to prevent, in fact, the operator. It all depends on their goodwill, and it depends on the US role to actually compel or force the Israelis to do so. So that's really, I would say, the overall sort of agreement, the key parts. I think what's interesting as well is how did the Lebanese authorities and also political parties, and particularly Hezbollah, react to this, right? Because this is, again, a maritime agreement between two states that don't recognize each other. Akram, do you want me to continue and move on that? Is that okay?
That's fine. We're good. We're good.
We're good. Now, the Lebanese president, or former president now, Michel Aoun, and the Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, and others were very quickly self-congratulating themselves for this wonderful achievement, because they're able to sort of, finally settle this dispute that has lasted for 15 years. But that was not really straightforward for Hezbollah. Hezbollah, that's been obviously fighting the Israelis and not recognizing the Israelis, their reaction and response to this is actually quite interesting, because they have Sayyid Nasrallah, who is obviously the Secretary General of Hezbollah, went on to even threaten the Israelis if they start extracting any oil before the maritime disputes. Hezbollah sent drones back in a few months ago, I think end of June, early July, to actually above the Karish gas field, which were shut down. But in fact, it flexed its muscles to tell the Israelis that we are not going to let this happen without any maritime agreement. Now, having said that, if you're reading between the lines, Hezbollah's response to this is quite interesting, because again, Nasrallah went on to say, well, we don't really have a strong say whether Lebanon's maritime border is at line 23 or line 29. It's a bit surprising, because, Nasrallah has been fighting and Hezbollah has been fighting the Israelis over every inch of the border. Suddenly now the maritime border doesn't really matter. And he went on to say that this is actually up to the Lebanese state. Whatever the Lebanese state decides, we will adhere to that. Now, I find that this, again, interesting, because Hezbollah has, in so many different ways, through fighting the Israelis, whether you agree or not, whether you're for or against, it has also, through that, did not do so in full coordination with the Lebanese state throughout history. And many times it actually undermined the Lebanese state. So suddenly when you see Hezbollah reacting to this by saying that we are behind the state and we will do whatever the state wants, then suddenly you feel like as if they don't want to be involved in a further conflict here and don't want to flare things up. That's my interpretation of this, acquiescing to this agreement and letting it actually go. And what's actually interesting, because Hezbollah went on to say, we read the agreement and we approved it. And that's even more shocking, because if you read the agreement and you approve it, let me give you a few things about the agreement that I haven't mentioned yet. The agreement said that this maritime agreement is a permanent border agreement between Lebanon and Israel, and it has to be registered with the UN. Now, so if you are fighting an enemy that you don't recognize, can you actually sign and approve a permanent border, or you do more of a tentative border agreement for a specific period of time until further notice? So that tells you something, that they've accepted that, which is very interesting. And more so, they've accepted the US role. The US to Hezbollah is an enemy. The US is considered to Hezbollah, obviously supporting the Zionist entity. However, they have accepted the role of the US not only in the negotiation. In fact, they agree that the US is a facilitator and the mediator. These are keywords that are in the agreement. That Lebanon and Israel should share the data on the Kana field, which means that we have to obviously give the data to the Americans, and they have to any operator that is, or the operator that's working or exploring for oil and gas in block number 9, which is where Kana is, has to be from a country that is not subject to US sanctions. Again, so all of these Hezbollah somehow accepted, which is very, very interesting to see the sort of the geopolitical sort of factors that actually allowed this to happen. Did Hezbollah flex its muscles, but then decided to not to flare things up and accept this agreement because it doesn't want to be blamed for scuffling this agreement when Lebanon is collapsing economically? Because if it does so, we're going to war, because essentially it put the whole country and the conditions were very right for a war suddenly, because you're saying if you actually explore and you don't have a maritime agreement, we're going to war, and hence not accepting this agreement that Israelis will start exploration of the oil, which automatically you lose credibility big time if you don't do something about it. However, they decided to sort of come down the ladder and acquiesce to the agreement, whereby in fact it's probably better for them.
Let me explore that a little bit further. I do want to talk a little bit about the technical stuff, because we talked a lot about oil and gas, and I want to get some numbers and try to figure out what that means for Lebanon. But before we get there, I am very curious as to why there is this rush on the part of Lebanese politicians across the board, but most surprisingly, Hezbollah, to accept this agreement that certainly, by what you are saying and what's on the books, is not really the full rights of Lebanon. They gave up some stuff. They had a de facto, in essence, recognition of the state of Israel, even if it's not de jure. So I'm kind of curious, what is propelling this rush, especially, like almost, 6 weeks before Michel Aoun left the presidency, there's this huge rush to try sign it. Is it that, there was something that the American administration was telling them, you either take this or, there's going to be a lot of dire circumstances? Are there economic benefits? It's kind of curious, really, what's driving this.
Indeed, Akram, this is very interesting. The rush, because they've been negotiating for 15 years or less than that, but clearly this has been on the agenda, stop and go, and suddenly, this agreement, the Americans were insisting in getting it through. And insistingly, this agreement was signed literally few days before President Aoun's presidential tenure ended, and almost exactly a week before the Israeli election. So literally, that was a window that the Americans wanted to exploit and make sure that no one hinders this agreement from any party being Lebanese or Israelis. And furthermore, this agreement did not go through parliaments, not in Lebanon, and not the Knesset. And in fact, the Supreme Court, I think there were 4 I believe, cases to challenge the agreement in the Israeli court, and the Supreme Court shut them all down. And they said this agreement doesn't have to go to parliament, and the Israeli government has the right to sign it. But signing such an agreement when there's no Israeli government and there's no Lebanese government and the window is closing, very interesting, where I think American pressure was very clear on both parties to get serious and sign it or else. Now, the bigger picture, obviously, this one can attribute this insistence, obviously, on the Ukrainian-Russian war and Europe scrambling for energy. Europe is obviously suffering, big time as a result of the war, and for not getting the Russian energy, and it's seeking all sort of different alternative supplies. And this actually reminds me very conveniently that historically, and Akram, you know that as well, that how the Marshall Plan, which was set up after 1945 to rebuild Europe, one of its key components of the Marshall Plan is to secure energy to Europe from Saudi Arabia through what's known as the TAP line, which ironically also passes through Lebanon, right? And then goes from Saida port to Europe. So here's US is sort of thinking about it, is that how do we actually get Europeans to actually get alternative supplies? And whereas Lebanon needs 5 to 7 years to get the oil, the Israelis are much readier. In fact, they can go actually start exploiting the oil right away and send it to Europe and secure that. So that's one angle. Another reason I find interesting as well is that the East Med is in a major geopolitical storm. The East Med, talking obviously about it in Lebanon, Israel, and obviously the Turkey and Greece, and Egypt. There's a whole sort of challenge and competition between two camps as well, between the camp which is actually headed by the Turks, whereby they're actually allying themselves with the Libyans, to actually challenge and get the oil across. And there's another camp that's actually has the Greek, Cypriot, Egypt, and Israel trying to challenge that. And those two camps are competing for which way to get the oil to Europe. And suddenly the US, through this agreement, in fact, plants its seed in that whole region, and particularly the East Med, where now it has a strong presence that actually it has sort of not lost, but obviously it's busy or busier in other regions of the world. But now it's just planted itself in the geopolitical storm, and I think it will play a role, and we'll yet to see that in the future.
So for Hezbollah, I mean, to go back a little bit to hear from the Lebanese point of view. So we understand the urgency that is driven by the Ukraine war, by Europe's needs, by the United States' interest in possibly placating and bringing not so peace as much as kind of ceasefire, really longer ceasefire into this area. But for Lebanese politicians who are rushing into this, as well as for Hezbollah, what are the benefits that they see from signing such an agreement, even without parliamentary support? I mean, what is it that they're hoping it will accomplish, especially, as you said, since most observers say no oil or gas, if there's anything to be had from the Qana field, is going to come out for 7 years at least. And even then, it is not the panacea that people are expecting.
Exactly. So Lebanese politicians, the oil, obviously the maritime agreement allows them to obviously explore any oil fields, which Lebanon is in desperate need to get any capital, because Lebanon, that's just as a reminder to our audience, Lebanon's economy has collapsed. Lebanon's, just to give you a few numbers, Lebanon's GDP was $55 billion in 2019. Now it's $15 billion. It's almost like unheard of, where a country in 3 years could just essentially collapse so quickly. Lebanon's currency has devalued by 95 or more than 95%. It's lost its value completely. And this is largely to very bad, and I shouldn't even say bad, because bad tells you that somebody incompetent. Is more deliberate action and policies by the political establishment, where they have impoverished the country to benefit the 1%. Now, so the oil deal suddenly is sort of a savior, in the sense that there's money that they can pump into the system, because we definitely are desperate for dollars. Now, it will take, as you said, Akram, 5 to 7 years to monetize it. And we're going to talk about that maybe later on, about the potential benefit of that. But my worry is that if Lebanon discovers an oil field today, the Lebanese authorities are planning to, most likely, since they cannot monetize it until 5 years, but they can borrow against the oil fields. Once you borrow, and you can claim that the collateral is the oil field, then, hey, I can get capital into my coffers much sooner than that period, which allows me to deal with the crisis. And this is very problematic, because the crisis we're living in fact, has to be resolved without the oil money. because you have to make the people who benefited from the financial crisis, or who led us to the financial crisis, to actually pay for that or be held accountable for mismanaging. Now, if you're getting oil money, you're giving them a sort of a carte blanche in the sense of letting them get away with murder, essentially, by using another external source of revenue that actually doesn't belong or should not be dealt to deal with the financial crisis, but in fact should be actually distributed to Lebanese population, current generation and future generations. So my concern is that if we do discover that they can siphon the money and in fact distribute it in a way that's at least definitely not equitable, that will be tragic for the country, because it will sink it deeper into the abyss, given how they have actually dealt with the resources. So that's what I think they claim. And in fact, I'm not speculating here. I know from certain sources that Prime Minister Sami Atallah, upon people visiting him, he would say, oh, don't worry, we will solve our problem, through oil and gas. We don't really need the IMF agreement, for example, because Lebanese economic condition will definitely improve once we sign it. Very irresponsible approach. And that brings us to the question of, if that's how they're thinking about it, we are in a very serious trouble here.
Thank you, Sami, for that. So before I go on with some other questions, I invite those who are attending, if you have any questions, by all means, please type them into the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll try to get them as soon as possible. But I want to get to two things. One is the technical aspect of things, the details, right? I mean, there are a lot of promises, a lot of things being made, but I'm kind of curious if we can just kind of lay the ground about, for example, what company is the Lebanese government contracting or to do the oil exploration? How much do we know about how much oil and gas there really is in that sense? Because, again, people are throwing out all sorts of numbers. And eventually, like you were leading to this question, I mean, where you were saying the money should go into the pockets of Lebanese citizens, not into the pockets of the very political and banking elites that drove us into this crisis. The question is there a mechanism? I know that there's a law that was passed, I think in 2018, maybe 2019, that establishes an independent oversight commission, I thought, that is meant to control the sovereign funds that this money would go into. So the question is that real? Is it something that will actually be implemented? What is your prognosis for this? So first, the technical part, is it really oil and gas that we're talking about, and who's going to be doing the extraction? And second, and perhaps more importantly, how do we control the flow of money, and who gets it, and how does it get to the Lebanese people?
Sure. Very good. All right, let me start with that, in fact. So Lebanon had, if my memory is correct, 52 companies that were pre-qualified to actually submit bids. And these companies have to apply as a consortium of 3 companies, whereby one of them is at least an operator. One of them is actually called the operator. When they opened the bids in 2017, in fact, they opened them for, Lebanon has 10 blocks, all right? And they offered only 2 blocks. And out of the 52 companies, only one consortium actually submitted a bid, which is actually headed by Total, the French company, and Eni, the Italian company, and Novatek, the Russian company. Together, they formed a consortium, and they actually want to explore oil in 2 blocks, Block 4 and Block 9. Block 9 is on the south, which actually was part of the maritime dispute with Israel, which was, hence Total could not explore any oil back then. It was put on hold for many years because of this conflict. So this maritime agreement would allow Total now to go and start exploring. Now, Novatek, so actually just withdrew this year from the consortium, and now Qatar was most likely going to take its share, and the consortium will be made up of Total, Eni, and Qatar, and that's how it's going to go. The Lebanese government has plans to open more of these fields for other future bids, but that hasn't happened yet. In terms of how much oil there is, look, there are all sorts of numbers, all right, and some are ridiculous. Speaking to expert in this field, and they said, look, at the end of the day, all of this, all the 2Ds and 3Ds seismic survey data that the Lebanese collected, which sounds and gives promising outlook for Lebanon, it's only when you actually really discover a field and assess how feasible is the oil field, then can you start talking about numbers. So I can't give you more than that. I trust this assessment because it just makes sense. Everything else is speculative, and some of these large numbers are totally, in my opinion, irresponsible because they sort of take you elsewhere, right? In terms of the political imagination of some of the politicians and how this is going to resolve all our problems. Now, let me sort of move on to the third issue about the oversight and mechanism, but also I'd like to sort of highlight something here. Given that we're talking about the companies and so forth. If I just look at how the Lebanese government and parliament manage this sector, right? Because that's a sort of a good indicator, right? From, in fact, 2007, they started, doing the work. 2010, we have a law that passed, and I can talk to you more about the law because I actually probably one of the very few people who managed to get and review and assess the minutes of the parliamentary committee that was actually discussing the law, which is the oil offshore law of 2010. And when I was going through it, I was just so puzzled by the debate, by the level of the debate by the Lebanese policymakers or MPs, whereby, for example, one of the MPs, if I may, just sort of shed light on that committee, because when you read it, you can start imagining what the debate is like. One of the MPs back then, and particularly Ghassan Khayber, who is an MP from Metin, he was saying, how are we analyzing or reviewing a draft law without the government submitting an energy policy, an outlook, because the law is a tool towards something of an objective of where and what should Lebanon's energy use will be in 15, 20 years. And shockingly, the Minister of Energy, Jobran Basil's response was like, no, you don't need an energy policy. It is the energy policy. So somehow we're mixing a law with the energy policy, and or it's actually in the rationale of the law. Very, very disturbing how the response was. And other things in relation to, some ministers arguing that why are we having onshore law and not and onshore law and offshore law, two separate laws? There should be one, and people were dismissing, no, we're in so hurry. There's no time to put them together because Israel might take our oil. When you're like, really, okay, if that's the case, it took us another 12 years, to even few years to start contacting these companies. So you see the debate, but the most worrying one is related to the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, which is an agency that was created back then just to manage and regulate the oil. And the debate was among parliamentarians is to give it wide authority, independence from the politicians, you know what I mean? And where the debate was going towards that, you see the former Prime Minister Hariri and the Speaker of the House, Nabi Berri, go on the side and decide, no, we're not going to do that, came back and imposed their conditions on all the other MPs and said the LPA will not have the autonomy, it will be under the Ministry of Energy and under the prerogative of the minister. So you see how those two leaders essentially hijacked the whole democratic decision-making process. And all of this is to shed light on what? Because let me sort of link it back. After the law was passed, and it took another 4 years to get the decrees together. It took another a year or two to actually get the companies on track. So we wasted a lot of time, and even time when oil prices were so high, relatively 2013, 2014, which we could have even gotten a better deal from these companies. Hey, we were too late, we missed the boat. So already I'm just giving you a glimpse of how the Lebanese authorities manage the sector or mismanage the sector. They have hijacked it and slowed it down because they couldn't agree until all the forces were in the right place, which means all the political parties had to agree on these decrees. Now, moving forward now, in fact, when I reviewed the law, a huge amount of time was spent on the Sovereign Wealth Fund that you just mentioned, Akram. Who is going to be in control of that fund, right? Because if you create a fund, this is essentially, you have to think of the institutional infrastructure, architecture, who's going to be responsible for it, which means who's going to be able to control the fund itself. And they couldn't agree. And they said, okay, you know what, we'll put it on hold. We'll just say in the law that we will create a sovereign wealth fund, and now they have draft law that they actually hasn't been passed, and it will be debated probably soon to actually figure out how they're going to do that. But it's not Lebanon and Lebanese authorities' track record of establishing institutions is dismal, to say the least. In fact, Lebanese political parties have undermined state institutions. So am I comfortable that these politicians will be able to set up a fund that is transparent and accountable? No way. And just because the way they have undermined state institutions, the way they've undermined the budgetary institutions, which means the institutions that are supposed to manage our resources, fiscal resources, they have really done a horrible job to this, undermined it in so many ways, broke so many laws, even constitutions. So now suddenly they're claiming to say, oh, we're going to have a sovereign wealth fund and we're going to make it transparent and independent after, in fact, stepping on all the existing institutions? No way. And then if I go on to think of other potential benefits of oil, right? Because you say, okay, oil can give you obviously the money, which this money can be put on a sovereign wealth fund. And I just mentioned how the track record of managing state institutions is horrible. So that's not going to happen. Another possibility, in fact, is oil can be used or gas can be used for electricity. And we know how they've mismanaged the electricity sector. You could say, oh, well, oil and revenue can actually, because you've got energy, you can do encourage sectors that are actually highly energy dependent. And we look at their record in actually industrial policy is dismal. If you look at how their budget, as I said, mentioned, and how they manage the resource is dismal. So here, Lebanon will not and cannot benefit from the oil and gas sector as long as it's being filtered by the very bad institutions that they've hijacked and undermined. And that's where really the major worry and concern for Lebanon right now, despite all the hoopla and all the victory and victorious speeches that they did over the maritime territory. If we're going to really look concretely at the numbers and we unpack the processes and see how they really manage the country, this situation looks terrible, actually.
Well, I want to say thank you, Sami, for that assessment. It's an it's a very realistic, but it's a very sad assessment of where we are. I do want to turn the time over a little bit to some questions that we received. There are two questions that are related. One is asking, they're both about line 29. And one is asking, how could they have failed to adopt line 29? But the other question is it possible to challenge this agreement at this point?
Yeah. I don't think they can challenge the agreement. I mean, look, at the end of the day, there's a lot of pressure came for Lebanon not to submit, I'll probably argue, not to submit the line 29 to the UN in the first place. I feel if Lebanon had submitted probably or approved or signed Decree 6433, Decree 6433 is a decree prepared by the Lebanese government, signed by the Prime Minister, but not by the President, and that officially recognizes line 29 to be the legitimate maritime border for Lebanon. The President didn't sign it. Big question, why didn't he sign it? Was he under pressure? Did he intentionally, was he worried about other potential impact on that? I don't know. I'm not privy to that. But to me, it's just connecting the dots. There's something there. Could we challenge that? Possibly in one court or the other. But I think, again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't have a legal background on this. But if I want to think of the de jure versus the de facto, I think the de facto here will win. Whereby they don't want to shake the boat because they think that this is, and I think the Lebanese authorities probably will not challenge it just because they just approved it, so how then you need some Lebanese official to do so, and I'm not so sure who would do that.
So as a related question to follow up on that, there are two questions that are also similar, which is both in terms of the Lebanese diaspora, but also in terms of Lebanese citizens living within the borders of Lebanon today. What is it that can be done if we're assuming this deal is a done deal, right? I mean, it's been signed. 23 is basically the line that has been adopted by the Lebanese government for a variety of reasons. Exploration is going to go forward. There's going to be whatever. But given the current political climate in Lebanon and economic climate, of course, the questions are asked saying, what can both Lebanese citizens abroad or within Lebanon do to guarantee that at least even if it's not a perfect deal, the benefits of this deal will accrue to the Lebanese citizens and not to the same corrupt political and banking elites?
Very good and very difficult question. The short answer to this is, all right, if we just look, whether historically or other countries that have benefited from oil versus countries that have not benefited from oil, let's just look at that from that perspective. And in fact, the researchers who've done tons of work on that, there's sort of a consensus on this, is that countries that have benefited from oil are the countries that have had strong institutions in place that were able to manage the sector, their revenues, with good checks and balances on the political establishment or political parties. A good example is Norway. Norway discovers oil in 1970, bang, it doubles its GDP per capita, is doing very well. They have a huge wealth fund, sovereign wealth fund, did very well. Another country is Saudi Arabia. They discovered they're actually the gas station of the world. If you want to go as far as saying that, since 1941 maybe, or 43. Its GDP, in fact, declined by half between the same period where Norway doubled GDP per capita. Saudi Arabia's GDP per capita actually was cut by half. All right, so what's the difference? Is that one has the institutions, one doesn't. Going back to the question, we need the institutions. How do you set up the institutions? That's the million-dollar question, given that these established political parties are in place. So if we cannot do that, what are the alternatives to do that? What are the conditions you want to do that? I strongly feel that we need to sort of, as civil society, as groups, we need to sort of keep the pressure to set up either these institutions and make sure there's oversight, making sure that the data is transparent, making sure there's regular oversight on this. And we need civil society, and we need people to be mobilized to put the pressure on this, on the political establishment, to make sure they don't siphon the money. This requires a lot of work and requires a lot of information, because how do we know what they're actually, what's in that fund if they don't publish it? So this requires very serious work, and a lot of it is technical, and yet a lot of it has to be coming from a larger, pressure, and not by just a few NGOs or think tanks for that matter, because this is, at the end of the day, is really a national issue that we need to do. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. And this also applies on to many other things, right? That we need to build institutions. And one of which, for example, is having an independent judiciary, right? For example, if you have that, that actually helps a lot, because suddenly, but they don't want that. So the same people who, in fact, who will be victims of that, sorry, I shouldn't say victims, a lot of people who are supposed to put up a judiciary, they don't want it, because they'll be in prison once you have an independent judiciary. So the same with sovereign wealth fund, we want to make sure they don't spend the money, and we need to put also regulation on that. But really, it has to go through a lot of work, and I don't think I have more to say on that.
Thank you, Sami. And again, a very realistic assessment for the very difficult future, immediate and far future. And I mean, there's a lot more to talk about this in terms of how we can mobilize as a community around this. But there are other questions, and I really want to get to them. So one question that we have is really kind of about future negotiations between Israel and Lebanon. And the question is, do you think that this agreement can form the basis for confidence building measures, or can be seen as a confidence building measure that would help us resolve the land disputes between Lebanon and Israel, and establish and basically get rid of that constant source of tension?
I don't think so. For the very simple reason, I think that there are enough actors in both Lebanon and Israel. Let me just stop here and just say, we're obviously assuming that Lebanon gets all its rights, right? And that's, let's say that we reach a point, will the different parties actually sign a deal or, an agreement that sort of terminates this act of war? I think, as I said, enough actors in both Lebanon and Israel that benefit so much from war, benefit so much from threatening the other and gaining whether election or power through fear than through hope. So it's actually it's almost going to be a perpetual conflict because it benefits the hardliners in both countries. And the minute you have a peace deal, those voices somehow have no room to play anymore. So they can't accept that. And I think that's going to be, again, a source of tension because of other reasons that, and I'm saying that once, and Lebanon should be getting all its rights, no deal will happen with Israelis until Lebanon gets everything it wants, fine, fair enough. But then if that happens, are we going to see a peace deal? I doubt it. So a peace deal, if ever is going to see the light day, I think it's going to be much bigger than Lebanon. It's going to be something about the region. And it's not going to be about Hezbollah and Israel. It's going to be about the Iranians. It's going to be about the Saudis. It's going to be about the Americans. It's a bigger game than simply the local conflict between the Israelis and the Lebanese.
Thank you, Sami, again for a great answer. So we have time for one more question before we have to sign off, because again, I want to respect people's time commitments. So this last question is really back to the previous comments that you made about what can people do. And it's more of a clarifying and kind of pushing that question a little further. That is, on the ground, what are you seeing in terms of civil societies, grassroots political movements, and in general, what is the conversation in Beirut and in Lebanon as a whole about this deal, and how are people reacting to it and perhaps mobilizing for or against it, beyond obviously the political parties?
Sure. Look, civil society, let's just say Lebanon has gone through a lot in the last 3 years. Mind you, 2019, there was this big revolution, big uprising that's unprecedented. What did we have after that? We had, in fact, the total financial implosion, people losing their savings, devaluation, losing their income. You've had the COVID, being people obviously staying at home and unable to, in fact, make ends meet for many people. And you have a port explosion in Beirut, which led to the devastation of a third of the city, more than 225 deaths, and a lot of people without, in fact, shelter. Now, how is this relevant? What's relevant about all of this is that the organization of many of civil societies has taken a step back. I think people are either impoverished, are tired. A lot of people are leaving the country. So there's a high level of emigration as a result of all that's happening. And obviously you've got political party, I'm talking about the established political parties and the traditional party, they've countering all the revolutionary activities in the last 3 years. So now we are in a sort of setback in terms of the ability of at least the community to rise or and challenge the authorities. The election, which was held a few months ago, in fact, still showed, despite having 13 new MPs and so forth, although the 13 new MPs who are not traditional parties, half of them are actually very close to these political parties in terms of their views. So I don't think that's a lot to celebrate. But all of this to say that right now, I think there is sort of I don't want to say maybe a malaise of sort, and people really either frustrated, either tired, either depressed, major mental health issues. We're really going through a lot here. So having said all of that, it doesn't mean there's not people doing are not being totally silent. There are people who are working, who are trying to operate maybe at a different scale, trying to regroup until further notice. But I think the country is changing. The fabric of the country is also changing as a result of the financial crisis. So there hasn't been much talk about the maritime agreement, where people are being cynical maybe about it over Twitter and Facebook, but nothing concrete in terms of any sort of activities. However, I should say that the 13 MPs, when they were elected, they actually said that they tried to push the government to adopt Line 29, right? Which was sort of an embarrassing act for the government. Suddenly you've got 13 new MPs saying, hey, if you want to protect Lebanese territory and maritime territory, you should go for Line 29. I think it just suddenly the Lebanese state didn't like that, or Lebanese political parties, because there's a new kids on the block who are sort of challenging the way the game should be played, so obviously they dismissed them, but in fact, one could argue they were right about that. So.
Sami, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, and the Policy Initiative is a great center, think tank in Lebanon that hopefully will be producing more and more great ideas for the future of Lebanon, and hopefully will bring people together to try to imagine a much better set of political, economic, and social and cultural conditions for the country that will actually pay attention to its citizens rather than the pockets of the political elites that we have lived with for the past too many years. So I really appreciate it very much that you are taking this time. I would like to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy day to be part of this conversation. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. I know there are a lot more that we could answer. We hope that you will continue to follow us, to join us with future webinars about Lebanon, about the Lebanese diaspora. We also would love to encourage you to help us continue this journey by contributing to the center by donations. You can point your phone to this QR code or go to the website below. And thank you so much again for all of this. We hope to see you next time. And until then, please be safe and take care of yourselves.